Hello, everyone. I'm Lauren Conlin. Welcome to Pop Crime TV's The Outlier podcast. As you can see, I am not alone. I am joined by world-renowned lawyer and the president of West Coast Trial Lawyers, Neama Rahmani. We know each other from doing the Nancy Grace show. I love Neema. I'm talking like he's not even here. I love his perspective on so many things, and I'm wondering if opinion wise, we're going to agree on some of this. He obviously knows much more than I do about the law, but I want to just quickly tell you guys a little bit more about Neema. He has over 20 years of experience handling civil and criminal cases. He's a regular on CNN, Fox News, BBC, obviously Nancy Grace, and he's the author of Harvard to Hashtag. So I'm going to have everything that you need to know about Neema in the episode notes. But Neema, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, Lauren, love you. Love being on the show. Lots to talk about. Obviously, this is a big case.
Yes, this is a huge case. And I did a live stream yesterday because I was really, really disturbed after I went on a deep dive this past weekend, actually, and a little bit last year as well, after the documentary came out where Menudo's Roy Rosello admitted that he was also assaulted by Jose Menendez, allegedly. So there's a few things that I want to discuss, but I think the biggest thing right now for me is the new evidence that came out in 2023. And the Menendez attorneys, Cliff Gardner and Mark Garagos, they filed a habeas corpus petition in 2023 with this new evidence. This evidence, in my opinion, is enough to, I would say, get a new trial for manslaughter. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer. What do I know? Can you please just tell me your thoughts on this? And I know it's probably a lot, but I'm ready for them.
Uh, All right, so just taking a step back, Lauren,
Okay.
there's different ways you can attack a conviction, right? Everyone knows about an appeal. You have the right to a first level appeal. So here in California, where I am, and I grew up in Southern California, so I distinctly remember this case. You have an automatic right to the California Court of Appeal. Then you have a discretionary right to appeal to the California Supreme Court. So that's the appeals process.
Hmm.
But you can also collaterally attack a conviction, which is what this habeas petition is. So once your appeal rights have exhausted, you can file a petition in first state and actually federal court and say that your conviction was unconstitutional and that the judge should release you. And judges do have the power to grant these habeas petitions. Now, habeas petitions are rarely granted. So the odds are against the Menendez brothers. So, I've talked to different reporters and they've asked me, hey, Nima, do you think it's going to be granted? And I said, just statistically, probably not. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the right result or the just result or even the result that may happen in this case. But we really got to look at the new evidence that came in. Is it something that shows that the conviction was unconstitutional? Does it show that they were actually innocent or that manslaughter was appropriate? And I'm happy to talk about manslaughter under California law as well. This is
Yeah,
super important.
that's
So,
what I'm thinking. I don't think anyone is under the impression that they're quote unquote innocent, right? I think the whole thing is that should they have gotten convicted, on this murder charge, life in prison without the possibility of parole, and at one point they were facing death. Is that the right decision here? Is that the right conviction? And in 2024, I'm not sure that would happen.
it may not be the right conviction. Let's talk about the different types of homicide and how self-defense plays into all this. So you have your first-degree murder, right? That's the premeditated murder. And the district attorney's argument was, well, they plotted and planned this and they shot their parents while they were watching TV. So it's first degree. And at the time in California, we had the death penalty. There's a moratorium now. There's a possibility of death if you're convicted of first-degree murder. The jurors didn't return a death sentence, and that's why the Menendez brothers are currently serving LWOP, what we call life without the possibility of parole. But none of that really matters. What matters here is self-defense. So let's talk about the different types of self-defense. There is perfect self-defense. Perfect self-defense means that if you're at imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury, you can use deadly force. You can kill someone. You can kill your parents and you can't be convicted because it's a perfect defense, which means that you have that privilege. But some states, including California, have what we call imperfect self-defense. So what's the difference? So for perfect self-defense, your belief has to be reasonable, right?
Mhm.
Now, is it reasonable to think that you're at risk of death or serious bodily injury while your parents are watching TV and you shoot them in the back of the head? No. Imperfect self-defense says if you genuinely but unreasonably believe that you're at that risk,
Mhm.
you can use force, and obviously it's not a perfect self-defense, you can't walk away entirely, but it does reduce murder to involuntary manslaughter, and that's a big deal because in California, generally speaking, that carries a 10-year max sentence. The Menendez brothers have been in for quite some time, about 30 years now, so they'd be able to walk away. It's essentially a get out of jail free card. So that's why we're going to talk about the abuse. I'm sure, whether their belief was reasonable, what they did after the murders, because if they do have this imperfect self-defense argument, then they're going to get out of jail.
Yes, I've discussed this at length. I believe at length just about the circumstances of their second trial when they got convicted. I've discussed the state of Los Angeles. There were the riots because of Rodney King. OJ just, walked and it was bad. LA looked pretty bad and the prosecutors needed a win. And I did feel like, I watched a Larry King interview with Leslie Abramson, and she even said when OJ walked, she was like, oh shit, this is very bad for us, and I was like, okay, she's right. And something else, Nima, that really really bothered me is the Menendez brothers went through a penalty phase. Their lives were on the line. And what they went through, these doctors and these therapists and these witnesses, they weren't allowed to go into detail about what happened. And it's my understanding, I'm not a doctor or a lawyer, obviously, but it's my understanding that when you're going through the penalty phase, all of this stuff is very important. I mean, if you are sexually abused as a child repeatedly, this should really go into consideration if your life is on the line. I mean, do you not feel like this was incredibly unjust of Judge Weisberg? I mean, I don't want to put you in the spot like that.
Sure.
That really upset me.
Yeah, so obviously different standards at different stages of the case. In the penalty phase, in a death penalty case, really any evidence of mitigation should come in, and the fact that someone was physically or sexually abused, that should come in. I mean, we saw it recently in Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter case, which the worst school shooting in American history, and a couple of jurors saved his life because of the abuse he suffered when he was a child and the bullying and everything. So, I believe everyone's entitled to a legal defense. And certainly at the death penalty phase, really anything that maybe mitigation should come in. And this is why when you're analyzing whether someone should be put to death, it's really a balancing test. Do the mitigating factors outweigh the aggravating factors? And it's really just that simple. So if someone's prevented from presenting evidence of the mitigating factors, that is a huge problem. Now, maybe it didn't matter because obviously they weren't put to death, but even during the trial phase, if a defendant is prevented from putting up a defense, right? The judge does something, whether it's self-defense, whether it's an alibi, whatever, right? That may reduce the charges or get them dismissed or result in an acquittal entirely, and that's a problem, right? Under our Constitution. So maybe, just maybe, the defense has the argument. But if I'm the prosecution, what I say is, well, really, what's changed, right? And, I respect Mark Garagos. I know him. I met him. I've been to his holiday parties and,
Mhm.
his hotel in Palm Springs. So this is someone that I know, and I know
Yeah.
lawyers that work there. The question, though, I have for him, and it can be this, it could be Scott Peterson. Obviously, he's handled a lot of different high profile cases, is really what's new, right? So you're talking about Roy from Menudo, those allegations and the letter, I think Kyle
Yeah.
wrote to his cousin. Is that enough to really kind of reopen this whole case? And that I'm not quite sure about. And now, if there was a legal error made in the first trial, that's separate. But is this enough new evidence to result in a habeas petition being granted when the appeals were not? So that's the question I have.
I guess I'm thinking back, and I don't know enough per se, but I wonder if they could cite something in the rulings from the or the second trial. I'm sorry, like, or sir, is that, and there was also, I don't know if you're familiar with this. It was passed in 2012. It's called the Sin by Silence bill in California, and that bill, it's AB 593, allows victims of domestic violence whose expert testimony was limited at their trials, uh, court proceedings, that is, to refile habeas corpus to allow expert testimony to weigh in on their defense. I don't necessarily know if a parent abusing a child would constitute domestic violence, but this has not been brought up anywhere in anything that I can see. So I'm not sure if that would even make a difference here, or if a judge would be like, you're reaching. But what do you think?
Well, that's a great argument, right? Usually domestic violence and it's the Penal Code 273.5. It's someone that's a spouse or a cohabitant, obviously involving children. There are different types of crimes, and there's certainly crimes that cover them. But even if it doesn't fit within the square corners of the law, it's certainly a good public policy argument. Look, this is what the legislature intended, right? This is
Yeah.
something that should be a defense. People who are the victims of physical or sexual violence should be able to argue that in court. And again, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't want to get hate mail, and I know that hundreds of thousands of people have signed a petition to free the Menendez brothers. I'm just talking about the law, right? And whether I think, even though it may be just and it may be right, that this habeas petition falls within the square four corners of the law. And, is there a square, reason, constitutional violation why it's going to be granted? And might be unjust, might be unfair. And look, maybe we get there. Maybe we get there through this law. Maybe we get there because evidence was unlawfully excluded during the second trial. Or maybe
Yeah.
a judge thinks that, you know what, they did have an unreasonable belief that, they were going to be killed. Now, of course, the district attorney is going to argue, well, they went on this lavish shopping spree afterwards, right? Cars, watches, jewelry. Is this someone that really, feared for their life even reasonably? Is their conduct consistent with that imperfect self-defense? Or is this someone that killed their parents because of greed and because they weren't getting what they wanted, and these were two spoiled kids from Beverly Hills? I don't know, but I could see a judge potentially saying, well, the jury heard all this evidence or heard the evidence of the financial motive, and they decided that's why they committed the murders, and I'm not going to disturb that jury ruling.
Yes. I mean, if you were a part of the jury for the first trial, there is a reason I believe that it was hung, because the jurors did believe, most of them. I think there was a few men, maybe one woman, who was like, absolutely not. I don't believe this for a second. But why can't multiple things be true at once? What they did was savage. It was a brutal murder. It was a brutal crime scene. It was terrible. I can understand why jurors would be horrified looking at those pictures and seeing the spending spree that Lyle Menendez in particular went on. Eric's wasn't so bad. Lyle's was shocking. It was close to $500,000 in, 1990. Shocking. However, I don't think that, uh, again, multiple things can be true at once. I think they are guilty of manslaughter. They are completely guilty. 25 years to 30 years. Yeah, you probably deserve that. And when I say probably, it's just like, I personally have not been in a situation like that, so I can't imagine taking a shotgun and doing what they did. However, what their father allegedly did is, Nima, it's unspeakable. You can't even speak about it. And imagine in 1990 having to say that on the stand. So I guess my whole thing here is, yes, all of that is true, what you said about what the prosecution presented. But I think what the defense presented in the first trial was also true. It just was 1990 and people didn't know what the hell to think. At this point, I just want to know what it's going to take. If it's not this, petition for habeas corpus, what is it going to take? Is what they filed this in 2023. why is it taking so long? Why has it been a year before, a judge hasn't said anything about this to my knowledge?
And so this is how the habeas petitions work. A judge receives it, he or she can deny it outright and say that I don't see any violation here. Or they can order the district attorney to respond. And that's really what's happened here. The judge has ordered a response, and then the judge can have an evidentiary hearing. Just say, hey, let me take a look at this letter. Is this a genuine letter? Let me hear about these allegations of abuse. Or they can rule on the papers. I think one of the other big challenges the Menendez brothers have, and this is something that maybe hasn't been discussed as much, is assuming, and I'll assume that Jose committed these terrible acts. I believe victims of sexual abuse, and if Kyle or Roy or whomever says that Jose Menendez abused them,
Hmm.
I believe them. I'm not one to silence any victim. And the question I have is, well, what about Kitty, right? How is the self-defense argument related to Kitty? Now, obviously, she's the mother. She's supposed to prevent this. She can be charged with failure to protect. But how was it reasonable with respect to Kitty, even if you believe Jose was going to kill you
Yeah.
so you wouldn't report the abuse? What possible good legal argument or even factual argument do you have for the murder of Kitty? I think that's the big challenge they're going to have here.
That's interesting. And on the stand, Lyle in particular in the first trial did really go into some detail about the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his mom, which was a different type of abuse. It was disturbing. It was very much grooming to me, but that wasn't really a word back then. But she was a sick person, from what I gather, and from witnesses as well, family members. And not only was she complicit, but it seems like she also did her fair share of sexual things to a minor, if that makes sense, incestual things as well. So yeah, I get what you're saying, where she didn't necessarily do what Jose did, but it's tough. I'm not saying anyone deserved to die. Well, actually, Jose, I mean, I'm kind of saying whatever, I can say it. No one's going to yell at me for this. But yeah,
Oh yeah, he's dead. He can't do anything. He can't. You
yeah,
can't defame the dead. So we can say whatever we want about Jose.
yeah. I mean, well, again, it goes back to just really believing them and what they said. But I guess, if in your experience, this petition most likely 9 out of 10 times doesn't work, I guess I'm just wondering what will move the needle.
Yeah. So look, we've seen these documentaries affect change, right? Oftentimes, these get someone prosecuted, right? R. Kelly, Bob Durst, and the Jinx, right? So
Mm,
you know, the reality is, in this country, Lauren, every prosecutor is elected or appointed by someone who is.
yeah.
So these types of docuseries or productions can have a huge effect. Even Britney Spears, right? She was probably freed in large part because of the documentary. But there have been cases, obviously, Serial and Adnan Syed, big
Mhm.
example where someone was free because of a documentary. That's someone who is probably actually innocent, or at least arguably, there's certainly reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
So there's no question that this can affect change. So obviously, we talked about the habeas petition, right, and all the
Yep.
support, but
Mhm.
one very easy way for the Menendez brothers to be free is for the governor to just commute their sentence, right? Governor Newsom can absolutely either pardon someone, commute someone based on
Right.
public pressure, or what happens after something like this. So and going back to Kitty, look, I agree with you. There's certainly evidence that she allowed her husband access um, to the
Yeah.
children and said, no one should go in the room, and she was aware what was happening. It kind of goes back to the how can I tie that into the risk, unreasonable even risk of death or serious bodily injury. And
Yeah.
you've talked about legislation, and a lot of states allow for the sort of the battered wife syndrome or battered spouse syndrome. So I think the argument would have to be that, look, it wasn't just immediately at the time, right? It was over a course of months and years that the abuse happened. You can accumulate all that
Yeah.
to argue that, hey, that's why I thought my dad was going to kill me.
Right. And it's their entire life. And I'll tell you, one thing I don't necessarily buy out of the entire case, because I do believe Lyle and Eric wholeheartedly that they were abused and they were miserable and they were scared of their father, but they loved him. It's a weird thing. You can't explain it. I don't necessarily believe that they were in fear of their lives from their mother. I agree with you. I do believe that they thought at some point their father could kill them. Absolutely, because they were keeping this disgusting, disturbing secret. But you're right. I don't necessarily know if they thought Kitty was capable of poisoning them or killing them just to protect her husband. What you say is very interesting about Gavin Newsom. I feel like, I mean, I am not a fan of him. I think he's slick, and I don't, not even talking about politics. I'm just not a huge fan, but I can see him maybe being open to this because he is so, he seems he's with the times, if that makes sense. I don't want to say he's woke, and not that this has anything to do with woke. I actually hate that term. I just didn't know what else to say on the fly.
Mhm.
So, but he knows, I guess he's familiar with Survivors Act. He's familiar with, just what is happening now in 2024 and how this affects people in general. Something I just want to ask you about as well. And I believe that Leslie Abramson kind of hurt Eric's case in the second trial. She was kind of put or caught in a bad situation with some of the doctor's notes, Dr. Vickery's notes, because he wouldn't have been allowed to testify if some of his notes said what they said during the first trial. And this really looked bad upon Eric. And I feel like, is it constitutional to, I guess, feel a certain way as a juror if you don't like the attorney or you don't like what they did? I feel like that is tough, and I feel like this may have happened in the second trial.
It's really hard. So obviously, if the attorney was ineffective, that's a violation. You have your claim. The problem is, it's really hard to actually get into the jury deliberation room. You really can't base an appeal or a habeas petition on something that happened in the deliberation room. So I'll give examples. If the jurors misunderstood the law, if they, um, you know, misunderstood the facts even, right? And they just got it wrong. There has to be a real clear constitutional violation. So something like they decided to convict based on race, right? Well, that's
Mhm,
clearly unconstitutional, right? And there's a racial animus there.
mhm.
Or if there's some outside influence that came into the jury deliberation room that did it. But you can't really get in there and say, well, they didn't decide the case based on the facts and the law, but they decided the case because they didn't like the defense attorney, or they had feelings towards the prosecution. That's not enough under the law to get a conviction overturned or to even get a new trial. So
Yeah.
it's really difficult to base, like I said, an appeal or an attack on something that happened in a jury deliberation room, unless it's a blatant constitutional violation. So even if they said, "Hey, I don't like the lawyer, so that's why I'm gonna rule a certain way," no judge will allow a declaration or a juror to testify to that effect because, frankly, it's not something that you can get into.
That makes sense. I just believe that after this happened during the second trial with Dr. Vickery, and he pointed at her and said, Leslie Abramson told me to remove it or else I couldn't testify. There were there were rumblings that she was going to get disbarred and she was going to be in big trouble. And it's my belief, complete speculation, no proof, that she wasn't disbarred and she wasn't in trouble because they didn't want this trial to be, to go on for any longer. They didn't want to start all over. I truly believe that. They really just wanted their conviction. So they're like, let's just let this stay. Let the jury hear what this shady bitch did, and then let's get our conviction. That's what I believe happened. I do believe something was not right there, and something more could have been done to reprimand her, not because I think she necessarily deserves it, but because maybe it could have helped Lyle and Eric, get a different judge, a new, another trial at this
Sure.
point, because it was very clear that Judge Weisberg, he was not going to rule in their favor at all. And I'm not even speculating on this. This is just from literally watching the trial. So,
Sure.
and yeah, I don't know if you have opinions on that. I know that like this is just
Yeah.
separate and not the same, but watching the Karen Reed trial, I felt like Judge Canoni was biased a lot of the time for the state. And a lot of people were like, no, she's patient. Alan Jackson and Yannetti are crazy. They're really pushing the limits. And I was just like, okay, I hear that, but I still am not convinced. So I can see where people would completely disagree with me. But you know what I mean? So, and I'm not a lawyer, and maybe you know better, but
Oh.
I felt like he was very biased.
Oh, well, the judge you draw absolutely matters. One thing about California is you can strike a judge. So every party gets what they call a 170.6 or a peremptory, just like you can strike jurors, you can actually strike a judge, which makes it a little bit better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the judge you draw can make a huge difference, and I talk about different cases, and I'm happy to talk about Karen Reed as well. But Donald Trump has a lot of different criminal problems. He's got a favorable judge in Florida. His case is dismissed. He's got a not so favorable judge in DC, and that case is likely going to go forward. And it just goes to show the judge you have matters a lot. Now, with respect to judges, a lot of them are former prosecutors. I'm a former prosecutor. They do have that pro prosecution bias. And yeah, for jurors to hear something bad about the defense attorney can really affect the case. Um, Karen Reed and Alan Jackson here from Los Angeles. Obviously, he's trying a case in Boston, a very
Yeah.
interesting case. The question I really have there, and by the way, we're going back with the
Yeah.
Menendez brothers. I would say the law enforcement witnesses in Karen Reed's trial, some of them were probably as bad as I've ever seen. Maybe going back to Furman and OJ. I mean,
That's
really
what
kind of.
I said. I literally, dude, Nima, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I got dragged, God, relentlessly by people on Twitter for making that comparison. And I'm like, how did this become so personal? Like, is Michael Proctor your brother, your uncle? It's literally just a general comparison.
Yeah, obviously, like Proctor wasn't an overt racist, but what he said was so unprofessional, so offensive. I could not believe that, in this day and age, someone who's a member of law enforcement would say that in writing, and then try to minimize it. Look, I thought the prosecution did a terrible job. Not to get a sidetrack.
Yeah.
The question though I have for Jackson, and look, sometimes there are strategic decisions made, right? We talked about murder and manslaughter, and the prosecution in the second trial didn't want manslaughter because they didn't want a split verdict, right? So they
Mhm.
just went for murder. Should the judge have allowed what we call a lesser included? Probably,
You're
I
talking about
think, given.
Menendez.
Yeah, Menendez,
Yes, yes,
exactly. Sorry, yeah,
100%. You're
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm jumping around a little. So
No, I agree
obviously,
with you. I
yeah.
totally agree with you.
But in Reed, the question I have for Jackson and the team is when the jurors said they're deadlocked, shouldn't you have asked, is that on all counts or just one count? And, I think they may have tried to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to take the mistrial. Then when they heard from the jurors that they were ready to acquit on the more serious counts of murder and leaving the scene, then they tried to submit the declarations. But at that point, it's too late.
So you think for that trial, it was on the defense attorneys and not on the judge to
Well, the
say,
judge, the judge, if I were a judge, I would have asked as well, so you can get some sort of clarity. The fact that the jurors say they're deadlocked and there's multiple counts, and you don't ask that question
no.
and you discharge the jury, well, it's too late. Now, again, going back, is murder the just result in the Karen Reed case? I'm not saying that I believe any of the conspiracy theories and the murder and her boyfriend and everything, but I believe Karen Reed either accidentally or intentionally hit her boyfriend. Probably accidentally. There was a lot of drinking involved. Obviously, there's a toxic relationship, but,
Yeah.
did prosecutors overcharge the case and try to send a message because it was a police officer? And now we're sort of in this mess. And it's a mess, probably one of the messiest cases I've seen in quite some time.
So
But
messy.
yeah, I think there were mistakes made all around, obviously on the law enforcement side, and it was so bad that now for the new case, they're bringing on a completely new prosecutor to try to clean up this mess.
I saw that he defended Whitey Bulger, which is interesting. And I don't want to get
Yeah,
too sidetracked with Karen Reed
yeah,
because I actually could talk about that case for hours,
yeah.
Nima. However, I disagree with you on the fact that they absolutely overcharged her. Murder totally overcharged her, but I don't think they were doing it for John O'Keefe, Officer O'Keefe. I think they were doing it on behalf of the witnesses. I think that these witnesses do have deep ties to the community. I am not accusing them of a conspiracy, but it is factual that they have deep ties, and they got dragged into this. And I mean, for the DA to come out and make a statement saying leave the witnesses alone, I think that was pretty much a like an FU. Yeah, like this is your defense. We're going to charge you with murder based on these voicemails, based on the text messages we found after. I thought that was totally bogus. But I guess it's funny because I brought this up this morning about how the judge had ruled in the Menendez brothers they couldn't use the sexual abuse as their defense. I kept thinking to myself, so if this was so bothersome, Karen Reed's defense, the conspiracy and all of that stuff, why doesn't the judge say, limit that? And then I was talking to my co-host Jarrett Ferrantino about this for my other show, and he was just like, well, it's not really, that's not right to do. It really isn't right to take someone's defense away. And he said, as a prosecutor, I would never take someone's defense away. Just go do what you want. And so that to me was more, I guess, just proof in my head that the Menendez brothers did not have a fair trial.
Well, one other thing I forgot to mention, Lauren, and you're absolutely right. If you're a prosecutor, your job isn't just to win at all costs, it's to do justice. So there is actually another possibility, not Newsom, not the judge, but the district attorney, right? Obviously, he's up for a pretty contentious re-election in November, and we're talking about LA County District Attorney George Gascon. He could essentially say, I'm not going to oppose this habeas petition, right? I think that 30 years is enough. This is the just result. We kind of saw something similar in Baltimore with, again, another case, but where the city attorney there said, I believe that there's reasonable doubt in this case, and I'm going to free Adnan Syed. So there's no question that the district attorney could do that. Now, we talked about politics with Newsom. It's no secret that he's looking for higher office. And what will a pardon or commuting the sentence of the Menendez brothers do for his national prospects?
Yeah.
But what would potentially non-opposition to the habeas petition do to George Gascon? And he's up for really what's going to be a very close race. He might even be an underdog to Nathan Hochman because a lot of people think he's not tough on crime. So there's a couple possibilities here. One is he doesn't oppose the petition. The other is he loses, and on his way out, kind of like I think Joe Biden is probably going to pardon Hunter Biden. I think there's a possibility that George Gascon does it on his way out if he loses. So something else to kind of put out there.
I'm honestly going to start a campaign now and write emails to the DA's office and to Gavin Newsom. I swear this is pretty interesting. And I'm kind of surprised, I guess, that this hasn't really been brought up, I guess, anywhere else, because they're so dependent on this, on their lawyers, which is totally normal. But it's like, I mean, this is so high profile and everybody's talking about it. And I think it was 2021 or 2020 when a bunch of, I think it's, what is it? Yes, Gen Zers were on TikTok and they were like, oh my gosh, we just heard about this case, the Menendez brothers. Why are they not free? And it went viral for a while. And so I'm kind of like, why was it not brought up then? You know what I mean? So I feel like there's some things that can be done. And look, Neema, if Erik and Lyle Menendez are walking the streets, I'm okay with it. I don't think they're going to come and shoot me with a shotgun. Do you?
Well, look, and we cover these cases a lot. Someone that's the victim of physical abuse and they, use deadly force against their abuser. A lot of people think it's vigilante justice. I don't condone it at all. I don't think that's the way our legal system should work. But is 30 years enough for someone who's been the victim of abuse? Probably, right? If someone's convicted of murder now, second degree, not special circumstances or, these things that can make it first degree or a mandatory life sentence, it's really 25 to life. And you're not necessarily going to serve the full 25. So, here are two people who have served 30 years, the majority of their adult lives. Are they a danger? Can they be rehabilitated? And I think that the just and right result, if they were victims of sex abuse, is to absolutely free them. So just
I
want to make
agree.
that clear.
Mhm.
Will it happen within our legal system? Maybe not, but there's obviously PR and politics and all the other things that we talked about as well.
Yeah, and it's I don't like comparing it because the law is different in every state and every case is different. But I have an interview coming up with Jody Plache and his father. I don't know if you're familiar with Gary Plache. He was
Mm,
the infamous. His This video pops up, Nima,
mm,
every Father's
mm,
Day. Basically,
mm.
Jody Plache was kidnapped and sexually abused by his karate teacher, and they found them. They apprehended the karate teacher. I forget what state they were found in, but they apprehended him and they brought him back. I believe it was to Florida, but this is the 80s, so there is no airport security. So literally the US Marshals and the FBI are walking this guy through the airport, and Gary Plache pops out from behind like a phone booth and he just shoots him in the ear and he kills him. Gary Plache is Jody Plache's father.
Got
So
it.
he gets tackled, he ends up doing basically no jail time. He ends up getting probation, and it's caught on camera, Nima. He killed a
Mm,
man and it's caught on camera. Total vigilante shit, but I'm all for it. Don't touch my kid, okay? But I don't condone murder. I know I have to say that.
yeah.
As I roll my eyes, I swear I don't condone murder. But really, it's interesting. So it's like, come on, Gypsy Rose. They treat her like a
Yeah,
celebrity. 8 years. Her mother. Have you seen those crime scene photos? Those
yeah,
are brutal. So
yeah.
it's a tough, nuanced situation.
Yeah, no question, and obviously, I don't remember the first case, but Gypsy Rose comes to mind. There's
Yeah.
the young woman who was being trafficked, who killed her abuser recently as well. And look,
Oh,
these are very, very tough cases because you have sympathetic victims that have suffered horrendous abuse at the hands of their parents who are meant to protect them. So I
yeah.
totally get it, and I understand why people feel for Eric and Lyle and why they believe they should be freed because probably given that so much time has passed, it's time and it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just
I,
before, yes.
I'm so sorry, Lauren. I'm getting a
Oh, you're good.
CVS at 10. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
I know you're getting booked nonstop, I'm sure, for Diddy and for God,
Yeah.
everything else. But before I let you go, I did just want to share this with you just for context. I work with a company called Truth Unlocked from time to time. My friend Paul Mayarday, he does a lot of statement analysis, and he found this to be very interesting in the Menendez case when they talk about the baths and showers with their father, showering after tennis. I just want to put this out there for everyone to hear. He said, quote, what we find in statements and interviews, and we keep a close eye out for this in statement analysis, is the mentioning of showers, washing of hands, having a bath, and cleaning. And first and foremost, it's unnecessary and unexpected in the context of an interview for a person to mention these things. So because we do these things every single day, it's it's not really important for a person when asked to recollect something that they say, "Oh, we took a shower, we washed our hands." Water is a form of psychological cleansing, and it comes forth in the language of sexual assault victims often as they want to wash away the event, the shame, the quote, dirtiness they feel from what has happened. And interestingly enough, it can also be found in the statements of perpetrators, where they find themselves psychologically cleansing themselves from the guilt that they feel in conducting these acts. So, an example of that would be the hiker that was picked up, and disposed of by a trucker, and he will say, I if he's being interviewed, I went to the bathroom, I washed my hands, I did this. Well, that's his way of kind of disclosing that he got rid of the body. So I thought
Oh,
that that was really interesting in terms of statement analysis, the fact that a lot of their abuse was correlated with showers and a bathroom. So I don't know if you've encountered that in your, experience in cross-examining people or, whatever it might be, but I thought that was helpful.
that's fascinating. I've been doing this more than 20 years, and that's the first I've heard of it, but it makes sense, right? You always kind of see it's a terrible image of a sexual assault victim crouched in the shower and, just trying to deal with the psychology of abuse and that trauma. So it makes total sense.
Yeah, and the fact that Jose Menendez wanted to take showers with the boys after tennis, I was just like, "Oh my gosh," when he said this to me, when Paul said this, I was like, "Ah, this makes sense." I mean, I it's gross, but here we are. Nima,
One last thing. One thing I will mention, just to give a shout out to my wife who represents foster kids. Typically, and it's not always the case, people generally will not usually abuse their children and strangers. So it's just something that, again, there's no typical abuser or anything like that, but just something that may make this case a little bit different. I think Jose may have abused both Roy and the kids, but something that may make this case unique as well.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I personally believe that there has to be more. I really do, because you don't just pick one member out of Menudo, in my opinion. I just feel like this is really tough to talk about. And I don't blame people for not coming forward. My God, especially when Lyle and Eric, nobody believed them clearly 30 years ago. So I can't imagine how tough it is.
It's
But
so tough. Yeah, and I know we gotta wrap up, but just prosecuting sexual assault cases representing victims, they are by far and away, Lauren, as you know, the most underreported crimes because people have a tough time, getting that voice and they're concerned about reliving that trauma. And the perpetrators, if you look at the statistics, they're only brought to justice a very small percentage of the time. So it's incredibly sad.
I didn't even know that. I'm kind of upset that I know that now, to be honest. Wow.
Less than 10%. Just look up the statistics. Yeah, the FBI publishes it. Very, very sad, by far and away. Um,
My
the most
gosh.
underreported crimes.
That's crazy. I had no idea. I mean, I could, Nima, I could talk to you forever. I'm sure we could like go deep on on a lot of different cases here. I really could talk to you forever. This is so fascinating. So we'll have to do this again. I know you're very busy, but I would love to tap you for an entire episode of Karen Reed, John O'Keefe from start to finish.
Lauren, I would love to be on with you. It's always great seeing you. Thank you for having me. Hopefully, I can be on again real soon.
Thanks again. And thank you to everybody for watching and listening.
Bye, everyone.